Yeah, my name's Nick. I've been working on a lot of these Tableau Cloud, Server to Cloud migration projects. So I've got a few examples here of the kind of thing that we look at and how we kind of approach these projects. So let's get stuck in. First of all, just to set a baseline, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Tableau Cloud differs from Tableau Server in a number of different ways. But the main thing is that Tableau Cloud is the software as a solution version. So Tableau themselves host the hardware. The end user experience is almost exactly the same as your Tableau server. Main difference for administrators is no more of that headache of managing the hardware, no more having to look after upgrades. All of that is handled by Tableau, who hosts the backend. You just get a site and you work with that as your Tableau content without having to worry about any of the IT stuff. So a Tableau Cloud migration, what that means for that is that you are going to have to take your on-premise Tableau Server deployment, so everything that you have on your Tableau Server, and move it across to Tableau Cloud. It can potentially be a very big project depending on the size of your deployment. So this does vary quite a bit, but generally speaking, it's a significant amount of project which requires a lot of careful management, not just the technical aspects of things, the actual physical moving of content from A to B, but there is also change management involved in there as well. It's a completely different system ultimately, so you have to move things across in a careful way to make sure that it is successful. That does lead on to that last point there. There is no magic button, unfortunately. There is always going to be some level of tweaking and configuration needed. You can't just move across. It is a project. It requires a lot of effort and consideration to make sure that it works correctly and that you don't hit any speed bumps along the way. So the way that we tend to approach these is in three broad phases. And I'll run through what each of these means, but we always start off with an assessment phase at the beginning to get our bearings, a migration phase where we actually move content around and test it and make sure everything works. And then we have a sort of a long tail at the end, which we call the enablement phase, which essentially just involves making sure Tableau Cloud works and that we don't hit any speed bumps down the line after the migration phase is ended. So that can include things like training and monitoring and all of these kind of things. So let's run through each of these in a bit more detail and just explain what each of them actually means. So the assessment phase, it involves getting a really clear understanding of how the server is being used, so what the deployment of the Tableau server looks like, to get an idea for what that means to move to Tableau Cloud. As mentioned, there's a couple of differences in the way the two systems behave, so being able to highlight those and bring those to the surface is really important so that we know what changes we need to make, what steps we need to take in the project before we can actually get to the point of moving data across and moving dashboards across. So the assessment is a bit of a deep dive into the server itself to enable us to develop that plan for the project, not just during the migration, but before and after as well. Once we have that plan in place, we can start to move on to the migration phase itself. So there's always going to be some sort of pre-migration steps needed to get things ready, but once we've got through those, it's then a case of moving the content across. So there's a lot of automation tools that we can use to streamline this process, but at the moment there is still some manual effort involved at some sort of levels, and I'll walk you through some of the examples there of things that we've seen before when we're doing actual migrations of the parts where we hit some, not roadblocks, but troublesome areas. And then finally, we have the enablement phase. So this is where we're working as admins alongside users, content creators, everybody who uses the system to iron out any last teething problems that we might have, any little bugs that we haven't quashed before we get to the actual point of moving the data across. Getting users familiar to the new platform, normally a relatively straightforward system, but making sure people are logging into Tableau Cloud instead of Tableau Server, make sure they're familiar with how that works in terms of connecting to their data sources in the new cloud-based system, and generally just make sure that everybody's happy and everything is working the way that it should be. So just to give you a bit more of an idea of how this kind of flows most of the time, it kind of follows this kind of flow chart pattern. So we'd start off with a deep dive readiness assessment as part of our assessment phase, where we'll take a close look at all of the Tableau Server data, take all of that, define a project plan. That will involve, taking a very careful approach at figuring out all of the steps that we need to take before we actually get to the point of going live and starting the migration. Typically, the two big tasks that are involved before you can actually get going with the move is auditing the content that is on your Tableau server. A lot of the time, if you've got a fairly big deployment, you might have sometimes fairly loose governance on there. So you may have content that's not really needed anymore, content that's just kind of fallen by the wayside, gone a bit stale. So cleaning that up is always a good idea. Setting up the environment as well. So you need your Tableau Cloud site up and running to be able to migrate content to it. But you also need to think about authentication mechanisms. You need to think about data connectivity systems. All of that needs to be up and running prior to the migration, so that we have everything ready to transplant our content across. And normally, before we actually make the move, it's a good idea to just ring fence the content that is definitely going, make sure everybody's on the same page so that nobody's surprised when their dashboard doesn't end up on the other side. So make it very clear what's moving, what isn't. And sometimes it's worth doing a phased migration perhaps, and doing certain sites at a time or certain projects at a time, certain departments at a time. But all of that should be defined as part of the project plan as well. Once we're ready, we can then hit go, right? We can use our automation tools. We can use our different pathways for the migration itself to start moving things across. It's important to mention the migration of content is not like a cut and paste. You're always going to copy from the old site and bring it over to the new one. So your data on your Tableau server will never really be impacted as part of a migration. You are just going to be moving that over so that it's now available on Tableau Cloud. Once the content is across, it's all that testing, rigorous testing to make sure everything is as it should be. Permissions are still where they should be. Data refreshes still working the way they should be. Dashboards still display the way they should. All of that you need to make sure that you iron out if any issues there crop up before fully going live with the system. So normally leaving a good couple of weeks in there to get people to go and stress test it, make sure everything is the way that it should, is always a good idea. Once all that testing is out of the way and we're all happy, at that point, it's worth agreeing a go live date to stop people using the Tableau server and point them only to Tableau Cloud. So that involves transferring all your subscriptions across, turning them all off on server, turning them on the cloud, and redirecting everybody to go up to the cloud now. Of course, once it's gone live, that's not the end of the story. We have ongoing monitoring that we need to do. Best practice to keep doing that anyway, not just as part of a migration, but keep an eye on the system just in case anything has slipped through the net on that testing. So that's generally speaking the kind of workflow that we see with most cloud migrations. So let's take a bit of a deep dive into each of the individual parts. I will pause there as well. If there's any questions about anything that I've just said, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll pause at each of these sort of sections to give us a chance to have a bit of answer any questions that have come up.
Nick, there was one question in the QA. I don't know if you want to have a quick look at this point in time. It's up to you.
Yeah. So Hans is asking about bridge servers. So yes, we'll come on to talk about bridge shortly. But yes, when I say no managing hardware, I mean that in terms of the Tableau server itself. Depending on where your data is stored, there may be some hardware required in the form of Tableau Bridge. But yeah, we'll talk about Tableau Bridge in a bit of detail shortly, and explain how it works, why it's there, and to give you an idea of the kind of scale that you would need to have for a Tableau Bridge deployment. Okay, if there's no other questions on that, we'll go into discussing the assessment phase itself. Okay, so the first part of any assessment is, as I've said, taking a close look at the data under the Tableau server. So that is primarily going to be your Postgres repository. So that's where you can get most of the information that you need to understand the scale and the scope of your Tableau server. Typically, or one of the things that Tableau have recently released is this accelerator. So I put a link to it down there at the bottom. It's on the Tableau Exchange. You can go download it, plug it into your server. It just reads data from the Postgres repository and puts a lot of very useful information in one page. So it's looking at things like where are your data sources located? Are they in the cloud or are they not? How big is your site that you're going to be moving across? There are some storage limits and other site capacity limits on Tableau Cloud. So it's good to be aware of that before you even start planning the move. And then the third section there around migration complexity. So what are you doing with Tableau Server that might be a bit tricky to move across? So things like custom views and alerts can be a little bit tricky to move. So flagging that early on gives you an idea of how big a project is this going to be. This is a really good sort of starting point to get you that high-level overview of what's going on with our server and what does this mean for us to try and move to the cloud. But what I would say is that if you are ever thinking about doing this, there is a recommended next steps there as a 0.4, and I think the key thing there is that this is just an overview, and there is a lot of implications about specific things like custom views and alerts that you may want to get some experienced help with. So that is where us as Tableau partners come in. We have got lots of experience doing these, so we can help run assessments against your server to understand the specific implications. And we've got our own set of readiness assessment workbooks that we built here at the Information Lab. This is just a few examples that we have, but it goes into a lot of detail around everything that there is in the server, whether things are published or embedded, where the content owners live, how many of your content owners are unlicensed, which is a problem if you're trying to move them across, how stale is the content that you've got. Basically a really big deep dive into the server to understand everything that we need to know in order to do a successful migration. Seeing all the data here in front of you is one thing, but knowing what to do with it is the next thing. And that is where Tableau partners can come in. We've got the experience. We know what to look for. We know what the usual steps are for these things. So we can take you through a step-by-step plan for how to address each of these problems. So this is just our sort of overview page, just to get a very high-level idea of some of those big KPIs around your server. How many custom views have you got? How many embedded data sources have you got? Things that we really want to flag early on. But we do dig deeper. We've got a more detailed analysis on things like stale content, breaking that down by site, by project, breaking that down to understand not just if things are being accessed, but also how old they are and also how big they are. So if you've got a lot of content that's not being accessed very often, but it's very big, it's just taking up space. So we can then look at archiving that off, maybe not moving it over to Tableau Cloud if it's going to start to push us towards that site limit. We've also got, looking at data sources themselves. So this is quite an important one when it comes to data connectivity, understanding where our data sources are. Are they extracts? Are they live? Are they on-premise? Are they in the cloud already? Taking a real deep dive into all of those and understanding which sources we're going to need to do something about, which ones we don't need to worry so much about, and understanding that scale. So this is where that point about Tableau Bridge comes in. If you have a lot of data sources that are on an on-premise network, not accessible from the public internet, you're going to need Tableau Bridge. But to understand how large a deployment of Tableau Bridge you're going to need, you need to know how much traffic you're sending to those on-premise data sources. And that's what we can help to dig out of your data to understand not just how much traffic is going through, how much of that traffic is relevant, how much is extract refreshes that people aren't actually looking at, things that we don't need to keep necessarily, to make sure that we have a nice lean deployment once we get over to the cloud. Okay, I just want to pause there for any other questions, if there are any, before we go through some of the other things that we consider. I won't go through all the dashboards that we have, but just some of the high-level points of the things that we look at. Can't see anything in the Q&A section.
No, there's no new questions.
Okay, cool. We will press on then. So yeah, just going to run through some of the key points really when it comes to doing any sort of assessment. So these are the kind of things that you could do yourself, just to understand how complex is this really going to be as a project. So as mentioned, data connectivity is really important. You need to get a handle on where your data is stored so that you understand how Tableau Cloud is going to interact with that. So there's, broadly speaking, two types of data connectivity that we need to worry about here. One is public, which is accessible over the public internet. So that might not be, completely freely accessible, but it means that it's reachable from the public cloud. Whereas private is data that is only stored or only accessible if you're on a private network. So if you need to be on a VPN or in the office physically in order to reach that system, that is private. So the distinction between the two, in terms of Tableau Cloud, if data is publicly accessible, it's generally going to be things that are already in a public cloud system. So things like Snowflake, OneDrive, Google BigQuery, or any of the major cloud providers, they are already in the cloud. So Tableau Cloud can interface with them directly. You just need to open up access through your relevant firewalls in your public cloud system. So, in your AWS, opening up your VPC, allowing that firewall access from Tableau Cloud. Tableau Cloud does have specific IP addresses. Each of the pods around the world has their own range of IP addresses that they use that are owned and managed by Tableau. So you can whitelist specific addresses for that traffic to come in. That's the recommended way to do it. If you can, it will make your life very easy to just be able to connect straight into your data sources, no hassle whatsoever. Leveraging the power of the cloud, both in terms of Tableau, but also your data source. If, however, your data is not yet in the cloud, if you have a private set of data that you need to still bring into Tableau Cloud, it's not the end of the world. You can do it, but this is where Tableau Bridge comes in. So obviously, if you've got a private network, Tableau Cloud can't reach into that network. You have to set up Tableau Bridge within your network, so inside your network, where it's got that networking access to the data source that it needs to reach. And you set it up and link it up to your Tableau Cloud site. So it creates a secure channel between your on-premise network and Tableau Cloud. So obviously the size of the amount of bridge servers that you need, the amount of bridge clients that you need, will depend on how much traffic you're going to be expecting to come through. So that's either going to be through your live queries to your data sources or through your extract refresh schedules as well. Bridge can handle both, but you need to understand the combined load between the two to understand how much throughput is actually being sent through there. Just as a bit more of a diagram to explain that a little bit better, Tableau Bridge lives inside your private network, and then you create that secure connection up to Tableau Cloud. There are a couple of limitations when it comes to Bridge. They're all documented on the help pages, so you can go and look at those at your leisure. But the key ones at the moment really are around file-based sources and embedded data sources. So at the moment, Bridge can only support published data sources, can't refresh anything embedded in a workbook. I believe that's changing in the next version of release of Bridge, but as of today, not an option. And file-based sources as well can be a little bit finicky. They have to be extracts. You can't have a live connection to a file-based source. So there's a couple of things to watch out for there with Bridge. But as I say, improvements are on the way. Bridge has come a long way from where it used to be, and it is getting better by the day or by the quarter. So yeah, the way Bridge actually works is through a system called pooling. So you can have multiple Bridge clients all within a pool, and that load balances all of your refresh and live query jobs. So the more clients you have, the more capacity you've got to do those refreshes. And it's really important to get a handle on how big that needs to be for you to be able to make sure you're sizing your Bridge deployment correctly, so that you're not ending up with refreshes failing or live queries being really slow or anything like that. Okay, so after we've figured out our data connectivity and that is all sorted, the next thing that we need to worry about is our authentication mechanism. So things are a little bit different in the cloud versus on server. On Tableau Server, you have the option of choosing between Active Directory and a local identity store. When you move to the cloud, you can't directly interface with an on-premise Active Directory. Again, because it's in the cloud, it can't reach into your Active Directory. Within Tableau Cloud, identities are all stored as your Tableau ID. So it's linked to an email address as opposed to an Active Directory username or anything like that. What you can do instead, though, is leverage Microsoft Azure AD, or as they've now called it, Microsoft Entra ID, instead of an on-premise Active Directory. So if you are using on-prem, you can move your AD into the cloud first, and then sync it all up so that it all works from there. Azure AD isn't your only option, though. You do have pretty much any SAML provider. Any major SAML provider will work. The recommended ones I've listed there are Salesforce, Azure AD, ADFS, Okta, OneLogin, and PingOne. I recommend those because there are dedicated and supported guides for setting those up in Tableau Cloud. So they make your life a bit easier. The step-by-steps, kind of hard to go wrong, provided you've got everything where it needs to be. One other thing to mention on authentication as well is around multi-factor authentication. As I'm sure many people will be aware, Tableau Cloud now requires all users who sign into Tableau Cloud to log in with multi-factor authentication. There are some small exemptions for that if you have external use cases, but by and large, if you're using Tableau Cloud, you need MFA. What that means is that if you're not going to use a SAML provider, if you're going to use the built-in authentication system that Tableau have, you need to link some sort of MFA device to your account. So that could be using things like the Salesforce Authenticator or any other major authenticator app like the Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator. Any of those will work, but you need it on a device. So you need a separate device to authenticate with. If you're not using the inbuilt authentication system and you're logging in through a SAML provider, you need the MFA enforced on that SAML provider. So for instance, with Azure Active Directory, when you're signing in to Azure AD, you need to have an MFA prompt on the account to log in. That satisfies that same requirement. So either way, MFA is needed. So there needs to be a system in there as well. We've had a couple of migrations in the past that have kind of ground to a halt when the customers found out you do need MFA, and they've not had a system set up for that at that point. One other thing to bear in mind is the licensing is slightly different between the two. So role-based licensing is identical between the two, but if you have any usage-based licensing or call-based licensing on your Tableau server, you can't port that over to Tableau Cloud. You would need to swap over to role-based licensing. The new thing that's come in there this year is actually a usage-based licensing for Tableau Cloud, which is based on what's called analytical impressions. These are each instance of loading a dashboard basically counts as one impression, and you basically buy a certain number of impressions. The only caveat with this is it's designed for external embedded analytic use cases, not for internal use. That's the only caveat with that one. Pricing, always go and talk to your account executive. There's always indicative pricing out there, but it's always best to go and talk to your contacts at Tableau. Site structure is a little bit different as well. So when it comes to deploying on Tableau Cloud, by default, you get a single site, and that's your lot. So if you're moving from a multi-site Tableau server or even multiple Tableau servers over to Tableau Cloud, there is some rejigging needed there. So you might need to think about restructuring your projects. So typically what we would recommend is for each of your sites that you have on a Tableau server, swap those over to then be a top-level project, and then have all of your content within each site nested within those. Doesn't change anything from a governance perspective. You still have full permission over each of those top-level projects, so they can behave the same as if they were sites. It's just a little bit more administration to make that work. There is the option to have multiple sites for your Tableau Cloud instance, though, but you do have to pay for the extra sites. They're not free. But the added benefit there is that you can have multi-region support. So you can have one site in Europe, one site in America, one site over in Asia. You've got a bit more flexibility there in terms of your physical location of your data. And one other thing to consider really is the actual governance of your content. This was a theme throughout the whole thing, but understanding how Tableau is being used, you can then look at how things can be improved. So there's always room for improvement, but the process of a migration is a good opportunity to sort of hit the reset button a little bit, re-put those rules in place to make sure people are publishing things correctly, make sure people are using things the right way. And it's almost like giving Tableau a little bit of a soft relaunch when you move over to the cloud. New system, new shiny toy. So you might as well set it up correctly, make sure it's all streamlined and optimal once you get over there. So yeah, all of this you can get a pretty good idea of from a full readiness assessment, taking a deep dive into that Postgres repo. Obviously, you have full access to your own data within your server, so you can go and pull all of that out, but getting a good idea for the scale and the steps needed, you can make sure that you can get help from people who've got experience doing these in the past. Okay, so before we move on to the migration phase, let's go and get some questions. Okay, I'll jump into the Q&A. Okay, so Brian's asking, does Bridge perform the creation of extracts, or does it act as a proxy? So Bridge will do the actual work of building extracts. You can kind of think of Tableau Bridge as a little bit like the extract creation part of desktop, but without any of the view building stuff. So it will go and query the data source, build your hyperfile, and then go and send it up to Tableau Cloud. Can multi-site be used for different school regions on Tableau Cloud? I'm not sure I understand what that means. Are you able to field that one, Scott?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the different school regions you might be referring to, but in general, every Tableau Cloud site that exists doesn't know about the other site for security reasons. So if you wanted to have a second site that was for a different set of users, different content, that will work great. The one thing that you'll want to know as you plan out what's the best deployment option is you can also achieve that with projects, just with securing the content. But the benefit of using a single site would be that you're only administering a single site rather than adding users to both. So there's a little bit of, it depends in there, but you can use it either way.
Thanks, Scott. So for the actual sizing of Tableau Bridge itself, it, as I say, depends on the amount of load you have going through. But as a general rule of thumb, Tableau Bridge, each individual Tableau Bridge client can handle up to 10 extract refresh jobs at a time and up to 16 live queries. So those are kind of your baseline threshold. Of course, you have the option to make a much bigger Tableau Bridge client with a lot more hardware and scale those numbers up if you need to. But generally speaking, I'd recommend having a fleet of multiple Bridge clients as opposed to one big one, because if something goes wrong with your one big one and it falls over, you've lost all capacity. Whereas if you have lots, you can load balance across those. If one of them falls over, you don't really notice because the rest are there to pick up the slack. So yeah, unfortunately, that one I have to answer with, and it depends. It's just a matter of how much traffic you're getting going through your system to understand how many of those Bridge clients you need. Sandrine's asking, how can you improve the performance of Tableau Cloud? Specifically, when the scheduled extract refresh takes longer to reflect the update. So that will, again, depend on a number of different factors to do with the data source that you're connecting to and how you're connecting to it. So if you've got a direct connection to something in the cloud, say like a Redshift database or Snowflake, you're probably going to need to think about that source system and how that's performing. So if that's already taking a lot of load, it's already quite busy, that could slow things down. If Tableau Cloud itself is also running a lot of extract refreshes at the same time, that can also form a queue, right? So if you have, Scott, you can correct me if I'm wrong on the numbers here, but I think the maximum concurrent background or extract refresh jobs you can do on Tableau Cloud is 10 at a time. So if you're sending more than 10 jobs off all at once, you're going to form a queue. So that could end up creating a bit of a delay in terms of when your data is going to refresh on the Tableau side. So generally speaking, for that, I would space out your extract refreshes as much as you can, even as much as or as little as 15 minutes on either side, or even 5 minutes could be enough. But just stretching that out a bit so you're not hitting a big peak all at the same time. Same goes for Tableau Server, really, on that advice. Is just make sure you're spacing out your refreshes as much as you can. In terms of like hardware, there's not really anything you can do on the Tableau Cloud side or managed by Tableau. So if you're seeing a situation where you have spaced all of your refreshes out, so you're not getting a big queue, and your ultimate data source is still performing okay as far as all of those metrics go, at that point, it might be worth getting in touch with Tableau support to understand if there's something specific going on with your situation. Is there an out-of-the-box dashboard performance improvement going from on-prem to cloud? I would say no, most of the time. If you have a Tableau server that's already under a heavy load, moving to cloud can help. If your CPU is already at 100% all the time, if your RAM's already getting used all the time in your Tableau server, you kind of hit that capacity limit on your hardware. Moving over to cloud may well help because that's going to have more room to breathe, basically, because Tableau Cloud is going to scale to meet the demand that is being asked of. However, if you've got a dashboard, a single isolated dashboard on your server that's slow, and you're not hitting those hardware limits, and you move it over to the cloud, it's still going to be slow because there is almost certainly something in the workbook or the dashboard itself that is slowing things down. So at that point, it's a case of picking apart that particular data source, the particular workbook, to understand where that bottleneck is, and then eliminate that bottleneck to then speed that up. Okay, lovely. I think that's all the questions answered. No problem. So the next section I want to talk about is the migration phase itself. So what does that actually look like? So imagine we've gone through our assessment, we've decided we're all ready to move to the cloud, we've got our authentication sorted, we know where our data sources are, everything is up and running. How do we actually go about moving data across? So typically what I would recommend for a smaller deployment, say if you've only got a handful of dashboards, maybe you've got or maybe even lots of people who are building dashboards, but each of them maybe look after 3 or 4 each. It can be sometimes easiest to just ask those content owners to republish their work up to Tableau Cloud themselves. It's not always the best option if you have a small centralized team who manage everything. You don't want to have to republish 100 dashboards, and that's where the automation piece comes in. But sometimes in certain circumstances, it may actually be simpler and sometimes a bit safer to just allow the content owners to manage that themselves. However, most of the time, we have larger deployments, we have much more content that needs to be moved, and we're going to have to move everything across in some sort of automated way. So there's a number of tools that we have at our disposal for this, principally the Tableau Server and Cloud REST API. So this allows us to pull content down from Tableau Server, transform it in whatever way we need to, and then republish it up to Tableau Cloud. There is a tool out there at the minute called the Content Migration Tool. it is a part of the advanced management package, but there is a version of it that you can get hold of for environment migrations as well. This can handle things like projects, data sources, and workbooks, as well as the permission on all of those three things. So it can be a useful tool to do that lift and shift without too much work to build any sort of custom integrations or anything like that. I would caution against using that without getting the experience of a Tableau partner who's used it before. It does have its own foibles and can cause, well, it isn't perfect, let me put it that way, but it can be a useful tool in some of these situations. But yeah, the APIs are really the useful stuff here. So for things like porting across users and groups, all of that can go through the REST API, as well as setting up schedules and extra refreshes. You can build API integrations to do all of that and move that across. This is, generally speaking, the flow that we have for the actual content itself as part of a migration. So here I like to split it out into what can be automated to what usually can't. So the blue boxes, we have things that can automate it. So between the content migration tool and the REST APIs, we've got the ability to create sites, to create user groups, or migrate sites, I should say. So moving sites over to top level projects, creating users and groups in cloud, setting up your projects, setting up your project permissions, all of that kind of stuff. The manual part starts to come in when you're moving data sources that have got or that are embedded within a workbook. As I mentioned, if you're using Tableau Bridge, you need to publish those separately first before you put them up to Tableau Cloud. So that's a manual step. You've got to republish your data source, repoint your workbooks, to get those data sources where they should be first. And as part of that process, you're going to need to be worrying about your data source credentials as well. When you're setting up that published data source for the first time, you're going to need access to those credentials and you're going to need to embed them. So that kind of goes hand in hand with that publishing of the embedded data sources. Then for things like workbooks and your schedules and your alerts, all of that you can automate through the APIs. When you start getting onto the other pieces of content around things like prep flows and metrics, some of those can have some manual effort involved there as well. Custom views, at the minute, there is no endpoint in the REST API to create a new custom view. So that is something that has to be done by hand at the moment. And then you have any external sort of other, anything outside Tableau Server that references Tableau Server, so things like external links and bookmarks, as well as any embedded content. So if you've got a web portal where you're embedding Tableau content, you need to redirect traffic over to Tableau Cloud from Tableau Server after everything has been set up. So you can automate some of those things depending on the system that you're having to update, but there may be some manual work in there as well, depending on the situation. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of steps, right? It's not a very simple process to go through, and there's plenty of points where things can go wrong. So that's why having someone on hand who's done this before can be very useful. So assuming we've gone through all that workflow and everything has worked as it should, we've got all of our content up, but of course our work is not done. Just because the content is up there doesn't mean it's actually going to work the way we expect it to. So it's a good idea to make sure to do rigorous user testing on all of the content to make sure that it works. I typically, as part of when I'm doing a migration, I'll move content across and do tests along the lines of doing random extract refreshes on random data sources, trying to test each type of data source, each type of data connection to make sure I get at least one success on each of them, just to make sure there aren't any problems with bridge configurations or firewall rules that haven't been set up properly and bits like that. So getting a bit of a, just as somebody running the migration, I might not be able to test every single piece of content, but I try and catch as much as I can before then passing on to the users themselves and asking them to go ahead and get stuck in and see what they can break. So as I mentioned earlier, I normally like to allow at least a week, if not two, of time there just for the testing before we go anywhere close to agreeing that we can go live. And then, yeah, the final thing to do once the testing is done is actually agree a clear communication plan. Normally at this point, you've involved your content owners and your creators, maybe explorers as well have got involved and done some testing. Viewers themselves, end users, may have no idea that this is really on the way. Ultimately, it shouldn't affect them until we say, actually, now you're going to this link, not this link. The idea of the migration is things should not change for them. So once we get to that point and we're happy and we're ready to go, we then need to be able to communicate that to everybody in the business who uses Tableau to make sure that they have a smooth transition. Everyone knows where they're going and why, and how it will actually impact them. Okay, so that is our migration phase. Before we jump onto the enablement, let's go back to the Q&A. So does Cloud allow access to the Postgres repository? Not directly. So you don't have the full access to your underlying data source the way that you do in Tableau Server. However, there are a set of published data sources that come with your site called Admin Insights. Again, help documentation is available on this that explain everything that's in there, but it answers the vast majority of your normal sort of use cases that you're looking for when it comes to activity monitoring, user monitoring, license usage, storage capacity. All of these things live within there. There is a starter workbook that comes with them as well, but they're published data sources, so you can connect to them and build whatever other views you want to investigate things as you see fit. So the storage limit on Tableau Cloud is 100 gig by default. So the way to increase that is with the advanced management package. That bumps your storage limit up to 1 terabyte. But I would point out that storage limit is for extracts. So that doesn't include things like your actual workbook files themselves. It's just the actual data hyper files that you're storing on there. So if you're doing nothing but live queries, that storage limit isn't really a problem because you're not really storing any data on there. It's just your extract limit. Is it allowed to test performance? Allowed to performance test Tableau Cloud after migration to prove performance with things like TableJolt? I'm not sure. I've not actually used TableJolt on Tableau Cloud before. Scott, do you have any?
Yeah, I can take that one. The primary things you're probably thinking about testing are extract performance and visload performance. Extracts, you can run all your extracts and compare those. Visload, we don't allow mass visload across the site, things like TabJolt, because it is a shared environment. We can't have everyone running mass tests on the environment. It's live production. But what you do have access to are things like Admin Insights, which would show you performance on those vises. There's things you could look at median, P95s, whatever average, whatever the kind of metrics you expect to see, and those will be available there. You just need to actually have someone log in and open up those vises to render them.
Yeah, I guess the idea is you're more monitoring actual usage of it rather than simulating certain levels of load.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, brilliant. So the last section is the enablement phase. There's not much to discuss here, but let's run through it anyway. So the idea here is that we always like to keep in touch with anybody that we've helped to migrate to basically make sure we're on hand in case anything does go wrong, if they have any other problems after the fact. So that generally means that we'll be available just in case anything happens. So generally, we're going to help them set up things like monitoring, so things like keeping track of performance, keeping track of how the system is being used, keeping track of any extract refresh failures, any other problems that might crop up after the fact. We add this as part of our migration, but this is a good practice to have on any system, really. It's the kind of thing that you would want to have on your Tableau server as well. Of course, the type of monitoring that you have, as we've just mentioned, is a little bit different. You're not going to be monitoring, system level information. You're going to be monitoring application level information, your actual Tableau Cloud deployment, what is happening in there, and do we have any issues cropping up. The one part that you would be able to manage system level is, of course, Tableau Bridge, and we can help set up those kind of monitoring on that as well, to make sure the system is healthy, make sure that it's got not hitting capacity issues, and all of those things as well. But alongside that kind of monitoring of the system and making sure things are ticking along, there's also things like training. So as I've mentioned, there are some differences. There's a surprising amount of difference for an admin. There's a lot more settings within your Tableau Cloud site compared to the settings that you have on a site level on the Tableau Server, because that's where all of your settings live now. You don't have TSM, you don't have any of the back-end stuff. So everything is a little bit different. Most of it is just pointing people to the right direction. The information is more or less the same. It's just in a different place. The one exception to that really being Bridge. So there are implications for managing and keeping a healthy Bridge cluster going. So it's important to understand how that works. But obviously, you've got to upgrade Bridge as well, right? So it's not one of those things you set up and leave. It needs to stay up to date to keep in pace with Tableau Cloud as well, which is updated on a very regular basis. Alongside the admins as well, you're going to have your users. So making sure people are familiar with any of the changes to the interface. As I say, not a lot. The main difference is signing in, but making sure people are familiar with it, make sure people are happy with it, and that they don't hit any other problems. If you are using Tableau Bridge, it can be a good point to instruct people how to work with Tableau Bridge, with Tableau Desktop as well. So when you go to publish, how that works as a different system, and generally just educating people on how that data connectivity works compared to how it worked on Tableau Server, which will be slightly different. It's also a good opportunity while you've got the engagement of your users to also help push any further training that is worth bringing those in, maybe even push some adoption a bit further and a bit wider in the business as well. While you've got this sort of excitement, the whole business may not be excited, but while you've got the sort of momentum of the move over to cloud, it's a good opportunity to kind of bring some more people in and help upskill those in using Tableau as well, and maybe even grow the number of people who are using Tableau across the business without having to worry about scaling your hardware as well. So just a quick recap before I close off here. The three main phases of our migration are the assessment phase, where we take a close look at the server, understand what needs to change, and devise a plan for making the move across. The migration phase itself, to move everything across from A to B using things like Concept Migration Tool and the REST APIs, and then the enablement phase at the end to ensure smooth running of Tableau Cloud, as well as upskilling users and making sure everybody is as happy as they can be. So yeah, that was me. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. And we can finish off with any of the questions. And if there's any general questions on everything I've just said, feel free to go now before we before I hand over to Scott. Okay, so is there a new command set for admins similar to TSM? So TSM itself is not a thing. So TSM is designed for back-end use, so you don't have any access to that. Tableau themselves handle all of that. Tab command you still have access to. So Tableau tab command is still there because that's more of your front-end administration, automating that kind of stuff. So setting up new users and groups and that kind of thing. One thing I would say though is that because of the MFA enforcement, tab command version 1, which you might be familiar with as the standard batch scripting Windows level command line tool, that doesn't work because you can't log in and satisfy the MFA requirement with version 1. So instead you have to use version 2. There's a few advancements with version 2. It's not it has support for multiple operating systems now as well. It's Python based, so it's a bit more portable as well. But that does support logging in with a personal access token, which does satisfy MFA requirements. So that is your option there. There are a couple of outstanding issues with Tab Command 2. It's not got entirely the same feature set as Tab Command 1, but it's got the vast majority of it. There is a GitHub page with all of the outstanding issues listed on there as well. So you can see what does and doesn't work just to check that it does work. But beyond that, what I would recommend is pointing you towards the REST API, because Tab Command 2 just interfaces with the REST API. It's just a command line version of interacting with that. So if you can do it in the REST API, it will probably work in Tab Command 2. But you might be able to find a workaround for anything that doesn't currently work by building your own REST API integration. Encryption at rest. So for extracts with your own AWS keys or Azure keys, yes, so that is a feature. I believe that's part of the advanced management add-on, where you can bring your own keys. Without the add-on, it will be managed by Salesforce, Salesforce Key Manager. I forget the name of it, but basically you don't have to worry about it. But if you do want to bring your own encryption keys, you can do that from Azure or AWS with the advanced management add-on. So does online allow site admins to create background schedules? Nope. So you don't create extract schedules anymore. The system is slightly different. So in Tableau Server, you'd create your server-wide schedule, and then people could assign jobs to those schedules. The way it works in Tableau Cloud is you kind of set that schedule at the content level. So I actually find it a bit easier to use. You're not having to manage schedule somewhere else. You just have, you go into your data source and you just select, I want this to refresh at this cadence, and that's it. So it's actually, I would say, a little bit easier to use. The one thing I would say, though, is that you can't, on Tableau Cloud, schedule something every 15 minutes, the way that you have the option to do that on Tableau Server, which is, again, a capacity thing. If everybody on the cloud site or on the cloud pod all set everything to run every 15 minutes, that would be a bit much. So I think the most frequent you can do is every hour.
Yeah, and just one quick thing to add on, because there was a question in the chat that looked like the Q&A. I'd have to triple check, but I'm pretty sure you can download images, PDFs of content with both the REST API, I believe Tab Command 2.0. So you should be able to migrate that over. And then a quick note on the encryption integration. By default, everything on Tableau Cloud is encrypted at REST. Every site has their own key. If you'd like to bring your own key, or manage your own key, I should say, there is an integration. Just one quick note that it's specific to the Salesforce KMS tool that's the direct integration. And then we're looking at future integrations as well.
I think I'm thinking of the same version of that in Tableau Server for AWS and Azure. So some schedules that are triggered after ETL completes on databases. So yes, you still have the option to do that, but it would be a case of triggering an extract refresh through the API, as opposed to setting up on a schedule to trigger after a process, if that makes sense. So you'd have your ETL process, it would put your data into the database, and then you would have to trigger a second script to then go and fire a command to refresh the data. You can do that whenever you want. The only limitation you'd have there is your site level limits. So you can only run, I say only, the site capacity for background jobs is 8 hours per day per creator license that you've got. So if you try and run more time than that within a day, it will get cut off. But it's quite a generous limit. If you've got any number of creators, you're probably not going to hit that limit in a hurry. Existing add-ons like data management. Yes, so data management works with Tableau Cloud as well. So things like virtual connections and the Tableau catalog are all available in Tableau Cloud. The other package, the advanced management, is a little bit different because with Tableau Server, your advanced management has got a lot of your infrastructure level changes, things like externalizing processes and all of this kind of stuff. Obviously, you don't need that with Tableau Cloud. So instead, you've got a different feature set, which is things like your customer managed keys. You have the activity log in Tableau Cloud, so you can do a lot of auditing of what's happening on your Tableau server. That's a JSON file that you can stream into S3 and then analyze as you need. You get longer data in your admin insights. I think by default it's 3 months, but with the advanced management package that can go up to a year. And I feel like I'm forgetting another feature, but I've lost it.
Say content migration tool.
That's it, content migration tool. Yes. So if you need to regularly move content, between like dev prod projects or anything like that, you can use the content migration tool for that, which again is part of that advanced management package. That's for both server and cloud, though.
Thanks a lot. Nick, just a process check. We have less than 30 minutes.
Yeah, no problem. I'm done with my presentation anyway, so should we hand over to Scott for his part?
Yeah, that'd be great.
We can round off with a Q&A at the end.
Sounds good. And there's one last question in there about integration with AWS Stone Branch. I'm not familiar with that service, but at the end of the day, what Tableau Cloud can do is things with the REST API and the Tab Command 2.0 to trigger events and respond to events. So I don't know if direct integration is the right word, but we can probably plug into the broader workflow. With that, we'll jump into some more content. So Nick did an awesome job talking about, how does this look today? I'm thinking about moving. How do I weigh those considerations? What are the feature differences? As well as, I think it was a good path to just kind of what a sample migration flow looks like, break down the 10 steps or so. What I'd love to do with the next 15, 20 minutes or so is talk about broadly what Tableau is, is hearing from customers like yourselves on what about this is working well, what about this is not working well, what can Tableau to help make this easier, and then talk a little bit about what we have on the roadmap to start knocking those things down. And then we'll try and end with another 10, 15 minutes of additional questions. I'll go pretty quick. I'll probably just do questions at the end, but if there's a good breaking point, we'll do that as well. Just a quick intro. Scott Smith, I'm a product manager for Tableau Cloud. I've been with Tableau for 6.5 years. Was in Seattle for the first 6 of those, and actually am based now in London as we're expanding Tableau Cloud more globally. I have been on the product side for about 3.5 years, thinking about how do we bring enterprises along into the journey of moving to SaaS. If you haven't seen this slide yet, I'm surprised. But just a reminder, I will talk about a couple of things in a roadmap. I will let you know when I do, just make sure we're making purchasing decisions based off of what's in the product today. So I just kind of laid out this agenda, but want to give 2 quick data points for context, talk about what I'm hearing broadly from customers, and what we're doing to simplify migrations. And you can tell me if we're going in the right direction. And then the first thing that I always like to caveat with in this conversation is, are we having this conversation because Tableau wants to end support for server? No, that's not why we're here. It's not what we're talking about. What we are hearing is that there are customers who want to move to the cloud, who want to take advantage of a SaaS offering, offload a lot of the administrative burden to Tableau, and focus more on analytics for those folks who want to make that easier. So 2 quick data points. You may remember Francois talking about this on stage a couple of years ago now, but I just pulled the data from the last quarter. Roughly just shy of 90% of our customers, when they choose Tableau for the first time, they're choosing Tableau Cloud instead of Tableau Server. It's just a kind of a good indicator for what we're seeing in the market, that more and more customers, as they either are getting started with analytics or getting started with Tableau or making a jump from a legacy platform, they're wanting to do so on a SaaS offering. And when you look at actually users that are thinking about making this jump from server today to cloud, about 250,000 users have done that so far this year. And that's already more than twice what we saw last year. Oh, there you go. There's the growth. And we'd expect, back of the napkin math, we'll get well past 500,000 by the end of the year. So that's why we want to, this isn't just a couple of folks who are thinking about this now. This is a lot of people all over the world who are thinking about, getting access to the latest innovation, reducing total cost of ownership, scaling and securing analytics as they go more broadly across the organization, are looking to move to Tableau Cloud to do so. The first thing, and Nick already hit this on the head, is we want to make it easier for you to understand, am I a good fit? Like, what does that mean for me as a Tableau Server user? One of the biggest things we've heard is, it's hard for me to know what the feature differences are. Like, how do I compare Tableau Cloud and Tableau Server? Where are things going? Where do they look like today? And what does that mean for me in the way I'm using data today? So there's actually two things that are live now. Just in the last couple months, there's a full article that gets both the 101 and I'd say the 201 levels of what are the differences between server and cloud. Nick hit on a bunch of those earlier, from administrative experience, authentication, licensing, some of those like big rock items. And then also gets into the nitty gritty of like, oh, like you're using this data source, that could mean this, but keep an eye out for this type of authentication mechanism for that data source, because it is worth validating some of those details, or it's definitely worth validating those details. And there's actually this workbook that's kind of your getting started guide to does Tableau Cloud work for the way I'm using server today. Nick already walked through it, but this is available on the Exchange. You can take a look, download it today. It'll just have you swap in some data sources for your repository data sources. If you're familiar with the TS, what we call them, but Matt Cole has built some data sources originally. It leverages those, so you're probably familiar with those already. The next broader area that I want to talk about is, okay, let's say I think I'm a good fit for Tableau Cloud. How do I migrate? And in Nick's diagram, you saw some different colored boxes, and here's kind of the flow. And what we're hearing is, one, those boxes should all be the same color. They should all be automated, and it should be as much of a one-button click as possible. We realize we can't get 100% there, but let's get much closer. So we've done a full evaluation of what are all the API gaps that are relevant for migration. You can see a snapshot of a little bit of that on the right. And just started stack ranking what is most important. Let's start knocking out some APIs, make sure that Tableau Cloud and Tableau Server have access to those items to migrate via REST API. The second thing we've heard broadly is that doing this at scale can be difficult. That can mean, I put in here both the bits, like there's a lot of data that moves. Let's say you move a terabyte of data, how long does that take? That's not something that takes 20 minutes. We need to improve that experience, but also think about that in the context of change management. Something has moved, it's in a new place. How do I let end users know about that? So as an admin, my queue doesn't fill up with tons of tickets because someone can't find something. Reliability, just think about moving things from server to cloud. Should happen consistently with a good understanding of, as an example, things like logs that show what happened, what is the prior state and end state. And then what is a smaller part of the conversation today, but I think is going to grow over time, is the change management aspect of this. Again, Nick hinted at a few of these already, but a great example, I think you even said this was, I've got Tableau Server embedded, either an internal portal or an external portal. It's not just move my workbook from server to cloud anymore. It's this workbook needs to be embedded in that place. Depending on how you are embedding Tableau Server visualizations, you need to update that. You may need to update the authentication. And so making sure that that's a seamless experience for your end users. A lot of that is not stuff that we can one button fix from a technology standpoint, but what we can do is make it really easy to identify exactly what needs to be done so that it can be done very quickly, and then make it easy to test, make sure everything is running smoothly. So like the 4 big pillars of things that we need to innovate in from the Tableau side. So now here's where we want to go. If you have been keeping an eye out on what's happened previously, in 23.2, we actually snuck a few of these APIs in to the release and didn't really call them out specifically about migrations, but they're there to help Nick change more of his boxes from, I think it was orange to blue. So if you're thinking about schedules, within Tableau Cloud, we refer to them as custom schedules, whereas Server would call them schedules. It's the difference between the ones that can be created or not, but the ability to create and extract refresh schedule is available today in Tableau Cloud because of this type of work. Same thing for subscriptions. The ability to create alerts net new, although there's a quick note there that the migration experience is not complete yet. We have more work to do because there's one aspect of alerts that it's a pain to get out of the repository today. So those are all things that are in the product today. They're in both server and cloud. And so if you're using server, you're welcome to, and you're on 23.2, or I think that's going to be once you get, there is no server 23.2. Once you're on Tableau Server 23.3, those will be available. Apologies for that. And then the fun part of where we're going, this is the stuff that more future looking roadmap. Some of this is actually even on our Tableau Cloud Tableau.com coming soon page. 4 items here that we've heard make it a pain to migrate from server to cloud. One of the sub buckets that Nick breezed through was moving embedded data sources to published data sources. What we'd like to do is just have Bridge support all kinds of data sources. So you don't have to play with moving those data sources around and changing them mid-migration. Your workbook descriptions would migrate smoothly. Your custom views would migrate smoothly. And project ownership would migrate or could also be adapted in a migration if you're adjusting your governance. So that's all stuff that's coming soon. We're looking at that in terms of currently targeting 23.3, all things subject to change, but that's where we want to go. And then there's more that we want to continue to do here. You saw on his list, both prep flows and metrics are things that are on our known list of we need to go work on those things next. Those won't be available in 23.3, but we're hoping to bring those in the later versions. And then the last thing I'll just mention briefly here, but I'm sure we might talk about this more in some of the Q&As. It's great that all the APIs are there, but just because there's a huge list of APIs doesn't make it necessarily easier for me as someone who uses server to migrate. So what we want to do is package a lot of that into what we'll, pending naming conventions, call the migration SDK or server to cloud migration SDK. And so this will actually be a purpose-built SDK that would allow you to build your own migration application and customize it based off of your needs. On the initial release, where it will be intended for a developer audience, someone who's familiar with things like Python or C#, who actually know how to build applications using those languages. And it's intended to be a developer tool to get started. And hopefully over time, we'll make that easier and easier to access. And what this will allow Nick and his team at Information Lab and other partners as well will help make it as easy as possible to get down to that one button click type of solution and focus more on that fourth pillar that I mentioned earlier, the change management aspect. Because we do know that there's no one button click for change management. People still need to be educated. There are differences between the products we want to make sure people are familiar with. And so over time, what we expect is that we can spend less time on the technical aspects of this and more on the value add aspects, which are understanding how cloud works, making sure it's running properly, get you up and running quickly, and have it in users test things out. With that, I'll finally take a breath. I'm sorry I just kind of sprinted through all of this, but what we can do is spend a few more minutes talking about other things you may have found in the experience, are things that Nick and I didn't talk about that we should absolutely be talking about, or if there's anything that you're curious about in terms of some of the upcoming items. I'll just jump to here. Actually, I'll just stop sharing so I can see what's happening here. The first question I see in the chat is from Leah. When is 23.3 expected to come out? Believe the answer, it'll depend on where you are based and which Tableau Cloud region you're in. Tableau Cloud will begin deploying 23.3 in October, and then I believe Server would come out early November or potentially late October, depending on set rough timelines. If anything comes up, we'd let you know. The next question from Corinne. We have public-facing dashboards that don't require a login. Is this possible with Tableau Cloud? Tableau Cloud will assume or will require someone to log in. Depending on the use case, maybe something that Tableau Public would work for, but then it's obviously Tableau Public, and that's a different conversation. Tableau Cloud would require that you actually log into the environment. I'm trying to think of anything clever we could do, but yeah, Tableau Cloud would require you to log in. Nick, I think you answered all the hard questions for me. I appreciate you doing all the hard work there.
Oh, you're welcome.
Actually, I have a question for Nick. Nick's slides mentioned about the usernames have to be email address in the cloud. What happens if my server is not using email address as username, using something like employee ID? How big the effort for migration?
Yeah, so that isn't too much of a problem as long as we can map individual users across to email address. So we need some sort of mapping table for that. We can then feed that into the migration process, essentially looking at your user ID in Tableau Server, looking at all of the content you have, all of the permissions that you have, map that across to now actually that's going over to your email address over on the other side. So it's still the same experience for the user, but their login is just now an email address as opposed to the employee ID.
Okay.
Well, if there are no more questions, I know Mark mentioned it earlier, the slides minus the last little roadmap bit will be available via the recording for future use. And I spoke too soon. We have another question come in, but you can always check in on the recording to come back to these details. And obviously you can reach out if you're interested in learning more. The most recent question was from Prince. Which table in the Postgres shows when Tableau licenses will expire? Ooh, how cool. Does anyone remember?
I'll have to pull up the data dictionary to find the answer to that.
We'd have to double check that one for you, Prince.
I think normally the easiest way to find out when your licenses expire is with a TSM command, or by logging into the server as a server admin and going to the settings page. That will list out all of your licenses on your server, including an expiration date. So that's probably the easier option rather than going digging through the repository.
And if you're in Tableau Cloud already, there's a TSE users data source that will have that information.
Okay. There was a question I forgot did we answer it or not. There was a public-facing dashboards that does not require login. can it be handled in cloud?
I might have missed it. The Tableau Cloud will require that users log in to access the data. Depending on the use case, Tableau Public might work there. Obviously, you would lose things like automated data refresh and some other aspects of the governance, but Tableau Cloud would not be a good use for public-facing items.
Yeah.
There's more that we're
Understood.
doing there
Yeah.
in terms of like ephemeral user concepts, but even depending on the use case, we may not recommend Tableau Cloud as the primary way to go about that.
Yeah, for this
Yeah,
use
I mean-
case, I also have one as well. I'm sorry, Nick. I also have a similar use case where we enable the guest account on the server, but guest account is not available on cloud. We know that.
Yeah, precisely. I mentioned earlier on the licensing point, there is that usage-based licensing available in Tableau Cloud now, but there are limitations around that. So you still need users to log in to be able to access it. The main difference is that you're not paying for your viewer licenses. Instead, you're paying for the impressions. But the mechanism is still the same. People still have to log in to access the dashboards. So yeah, that part hasn't changed.
Right. Great. This is a great insights presentation, tips, tricks. Thank you. Thank you so much, Nick and Scott. I guess this
Thank
will
you, Matt.
conclude our webinar today. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. If anyone has any topics, either you want to present or you want to learn more, feel free to reach out to me. You can find me from the group, from the talk. And also all the previous recordings are also available there. You go to this talk, you will find them. And also next month, I do have part 3 of the server security and the management. That's my last talk of the 3 series. Have a great day. Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for hosting us,
Thank
Mark.
you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Scott and Nick, this is awesome. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.